Hey, what are you two doing in my land?
We were just passing through, didn't mean to trespass.
What if two of the most feared outlaw bikers in Texas were bleeding out in the desert, and the only man who could save them was a 78-year-old Marine everyone had forgotten? This is not just a story about survival. It's about duty, hidden brotherhood, and a debt that would echo across West Texas for generations. Stay with me until the final chapter because what happened next turned one quiet rancher into a legend still whispered in roadside diners from El Paso to Dallas. And if you believe courage has no expiration date, make sure you subscribe because stories like this remind us why honor never dies. The desert outside Fort Stockton had always belonged to the wind, the rattlesnakes, and to 78-year-old Harold Hank Whitaker, a widowed veteran whose hands were as weathered as the fence posts he mended every afternoon. And on that scorching October day, when the heat shimmered like liquid silver across the horizon, he was checking his property line with wire cutters in one hand and a canteen under his arm, when the silence shattered beneath a column of black smoke rising in the distance, twisting upward in a way that didn't look like oil field burn-off, but like something violent and final. And then came nothing. No roar of engines. No voices calling for help. Just the empty howl of desert wind carrying the scent of burning rubber and gasoline. And when the smoke began to thin, the land felt heavier than before, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Hank stood still, calculating the way he had learned to calculate decades ago in a jungle far from home, measuring distance instead of danger, deciding whether trouble was coming toward him or waiting for him to find it. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing how far this channel reaches. And if you enjoy powerful emotional stories with real-life lessons, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Hank squinted against the glare, watching the black column twist skyward like a dark finger pointing at something the desert wanted hidden. For a moment, he convinced himself it was just another oil field flare-off, the kind that lit up the horizon most evenings when the rigs burned off excess gas. But this smoke was different, thicker, angrier, and it rose from a stretch of road where no wells operated. He stood there listening, and that's when the wrongness settled over him. No engines. No distant rumble of trucks or the whine of motorcycles fading into the distance. Just wind scraping across rock and sand, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning rubber. Hank turned back toward his ranch house, his boots crunching through the hardpan. He climbed into his old Ford F-150, its blue paint faded to the color of forgotten sky, and reached behind the seat for the green canvas bag he'd carried out of Vietnam 40 years ago. Marine issue field kit. He kept it there out of habit, the way some men kept rosaries or lucky coins. The engine turned over with a reluctant cough. Hank shifted into gear and pointed the truck toward the smoke, toward whatever trouble waited in the emptiness ahead. The Harleys lay on their sides like dying animals, chrome glinting uselessly in the sun, their leather saddlebags spilling contents across the sand. Hank killed the engine and stepped out into heat that felt like standing too close to a furnace. Two men, both wearing the unmistakable cuts of the Hells Angels, patches declaring allegiance to something most people crossed the street to avoid. The first man, older and built like a linebacker, lay twisted at an unnatural angle, his leg clearly broken, consciousness flickering behind half-closed eyes. The second man, younger and lean, wasn't moving at all, his lips cracked and bleeding, his breathing shallow enough that Hank had to watch his chest twice to be sure it was still rising. Hank's first thought came quick and certain. Walk away. You fought enough battles. Let somebody else carry this weight. He was already turning back toward his truck when something caught his eye. A small patch sewn onto the older man's vest, just above the Hells Angels rocker. For simple words in gold thread, support our veterans. Hank stopped cold. These men honored his brothers. That changed everything. Hank dropped to his knees beside the older man, and 40 years dissolved like morning fog. His hands moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with muscle knowing what the mind had tried to forget. He yanked his leather belt free and cinched it tight above the compound fracture, watching the flow of blood slow to a seep. The younger one needed water. Hank tilted the canteen carefully, letting drops fall between cracked lips, waiting for the throat to swallow before giving more. Too much too fast would bring it all back up. He pulled fence posts from the truck bed and tore his spare shirt into strips, binding the broken leg straight and rigid. Then he dragged them both, one at a time, into the narrow shadow cast by his F-150, their dead weight leaving deep grooves in the sand. Hank pulled out his phone. No signal. Out here there never was. Nearest hospital sat 70 miles east in Midland. 70 miles of empty road and merciless sun. He looked down at the two men barely clinging to life. Not on my watch, he thought, and started loading them into the truck bed. Hank wedged both men into the truck bed as gently as urgency allowed, tucking his field kit between them to keep them from sliding. The F-150 suspension groaned as he floored it onto the two-lane blacktop, the speedometer climbing past 60, 70, 80, finally settling at 90 as the engine screamed and the desert blurred into streaks of tan and ochre. The sun hammered down without mercy, turning metal into griddle and air into something barely breathable. The first tire blew near the 20-mile mark, the truck lurching hard right. Hank fought the wheel straight and kept his foot buried in the accelerator. Rubber shredded and the rim sparked against asphalt, but he didn't slow. The second tire gave up 10 miles later with a sound like a gunshot. Then he heard it. Silence from the truck bed where there should have been groaning. Hank slammed the brakes and vaulted over the tailgate. The older man, Ridge, had gone still, his chest no longer moving. Hank locked his hands together and drove them down hard again and again, counting compressions the way Korsman had taught him in another century. "Not today, son," he growled through gritted teeth. "Not in my desert." The chest hitched. Breath returned. Hank climbed back behind the wheel and drove. The F-150 limped into Midland Memorial on 2 rims and 2 shredded tires, leaving a trail of sparks across the emergency entrance. Hank laid on the horn until white coats came running. Doctors swarmed the truck bed, barking orders Hank barely registered. 4 lines. Backboards. The controlled chaos of trauma response. A young physician with tired eyes looked up at him after the initial assessment. "If you'd arrived 10 minutes later, they'd be dead." Hank nodded once, his jaw tight. A nurse approached with a clipboard, pen poised. "Sir, we need your name, insurance information, contact." But Hank was already walking away, his boots echoing across the parking lot. He didn't wait for thanks. Didn't need them. Marines didn't save lives for gratitude. They did it because leaving men behind wasn't an option. The drive home took twice as long on ruined wheels, the truck limping and groaning like something wounded. His hands shook on the steering wheel, adrenaline finally draining away and leaving only exhaustion in its wake. When he pulled up to his ranch, the silence wrapped around him again, absolute and familiar. He sat in the cab for a long time, staring at nothing, before finally going inside. 3 weeks passed in the rhythm Hank knew best. Fences mended. Cattle checked. The desert returning to its patient, indifferent silence. He'd almost convinced himself that day had been just another chapter in a long life of chapters best left unread. Then one afternoon, he heard it. A distant rumble rolling across the flatland like approaching thunder, except the sky was clear and blue and merciless. Not thunder. Engines. 25 motorcycles materialized through the heat shimmer, chrome catching sunlight as they turned up his dirt driveway in formation. Hank stepped onto his porch and reached for the rifle he kept by the door, his pulse steady but alert. In his experience, this many bikers arriving unannounced meant one thing: trouble. The engines cut simultaneously, leaving only dust settling in the still air. Two men stepped forward on crutches. Ridge and Cody, alive and healing. They moved slowly, deliberately, until they stood 10 feet from Hank's porch. Then they did something that made the old Marine's throat tighten. They removed their cuts, folded them with reverence, and lowered themselves to kneel in the dust. "Sir," Ridge said, his voice rough with emotion, "you saved our lives." Ridge struggled back to his feet, leaning heavy on the crutches, and pulled a folded envelope from his jacket. His hands shook slightly as he held it out. "We were coming back from El Paso," he said. "Charity run. This envelope has $50,000 in it, all headed to a veteran shelter in Odessa. Place is barely hanging on, about to close its doors. Men sleeping on the street, some of them Marines like you, sir. We raised this money quiet. No cameras, no press. Just brothers taking care of brothers." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "That crash should have killed us both. Should have scattered this money across the desert for the wind to take. But you—" Ridge shook his head. "You didn't just save 2 bikers that day." Hank's jaw worked, understanding settling over him like weight. "You saved a home for homeless veterans. Your brothers." The old Marine looked away toward the horizon, blinking against sunlight that suddenly seemed too bright. His eyes watered for the first time in years, tears he hadn't allowed since Margaret's funeral. "Didn't know," he managed. "You do now," Ridge said quietly. They came back the next morning with tools and lumber and a determination that reminded Hank of military precision. Over the following weeks, 25 men in leather transformed his struggling ranch into something he'd stopped believing it could be. New fence posts marched across the property line, straight and true. They tore off rotted shingles and laid fresh ones, sealed leaks that had dripped through 3 winters. They installed a new water pump system that actually worked, and rebuilt his F-150 suspension until it rode smooth as the day it rolled off the assembly line. On the final day, they planted a wooden sign at the entrance to his driveway, burned letters reading, "Whitaker's Ridge, protected by Brotherhood." Word traveled fast in West Texas. Through diners and gas stations, barbershops and church parking lots, the story spread like brushfire. People in Fort Stockton stopped calling him Old Man Whitaker when they passed him in town. The new name came quieter, spoken with something that sounded like reverence. The Guardian of the Desert. Hank heard it first from a waitress at the diner, then from the hardware store clerk, then from strangers who nodded respectfully when he walked by. Months later, Hank stood in a crowded community center in Odessa, surrounded by men who bore the same invisible scars he carried. The veteran shelter was thriving now, beds full, meals served, counselors hired. His rescue had made this possible, though he'd never intended to save anything but 2 lives bleeding out in the sand. Ridge found him near the coffee table and handed him a small leather package wrapped in brown paper. Inside lay a custom-made patch, expertly stitched. The words read, "Semper Fi, Desert Angel." Hank didn't cry. Marines didn't cry at 78 any more than they had at 18. But his voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Never thought I'd fight beside angels." Ridge smiled, the kind of smile that held weight and memory. "Guess we all need saving sometimes." Hank pinned the patch to his jacket, and the room seemed to shift around him. Veterans and bikers, 2 tribes who'd circled each other warily for decades, now standing shoulder to shoulder in respect. 2 tribes. 1 code. Honor those who serve. The desert remembers. West Texas remembers. And somewhere on a dusty road outside Fort Stockton, an old Marine proved that warriors never truly retire. They just find new battles worth fighting.
And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it or learned something new, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps support the channel. If you're new here, Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop your thoughts or questions in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.